Hattie Shasta College, Humanities 2. For some reason, my camera is not working on my computer, so you're going to miss my incredible face. Hope you guys are doing well. It is the new day, new week. I hope you're getting your papers in. I'm getting a lot of people who are misreading the due dates. They change. Everything is not predictable in this class. So please look at those due dates closely. Um, they change whenever I sign the paper. I usually give guys a week. I'm going to sign a paper today. Do this Friday because it's a holiday after this, and I don't want you guys to have to do homework over the highway holiday. You're going to write a paper, essay, critical essay, analytical essay on the silent film by Charlie Chaplin, The Kid. I will post it in modulars later on today. Um, right now, we got to buzz through the history of this film world. I covered some early days of film. We're going to the 1920s, coming out of World War One. That's what's going on in the country. We're feeling pretty good that we survived the war, and we're feeling pretty prosperous. Women got the right to vote, and so women are feeling free for the first time. They're cutting their hair, they're smoking cigarettes, and they're drinking booze with the men. So, other than that, it's called that era is called the Roaring Twenties. The reason why they call it that because things were popping. Booze, liquor was outlawed for 10 years. You couldn't legally buy booze, but didn't stop people from drinking. It's when the culture of gangsterism arose in this country. Suddenly, there was gangsters uh, selling illegal liquor to everyone they could, and they had to go to a speakeasy club. They have to be a member, um, and they're all down there in the club having a good time. Upstanding citizens. That wasn't like fentanyl or something. It was everybody was having a good time, except for the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover, who was trying to bust anybody who had liquor. It lasted 10 years, but it didn't stop anybody for having a good time. In the meantime, we had these three great comedians rise up out of Hollywood: Charlie Chaplin, who you're going to write a paper about, um, Harold Lloyd, and Buster Keaton. They each have a different style. People wanted to laugh and have a good time. So the silent movies, there some of them were very serious during this time, not just comedies. Of course, they're all in glorious black and white, and there is no spoken dialogue, but they aren't silent. They had musical backing usually, and sometimes even sound effects. Anywho, so people are watching movies like never before. They're going to the theaters. They're enjoying these palatial theaters that they built, very ornate theaters in major cities. They built one in here in Reading in the 30s. The Cascade was built in the 30s to look like an Egyptian palace, which was for some reason, the thing they wanted to emulate. So it was a special deal to go to a movie. People got dressed up to go to the movies. They went out and to dinner, and then would take a movie in. Um, it was a formal affair, and each of these comedians had a huge following in the day. Charlie Chaplin is the one that most people remember. Um, I don't have a preference. I love Buster Keaton. His was a real physical comedy. He did some great movies. One was called The General. Um, Harold Lloyd was more of a he played a nerd. He usually they took on a character. Uh, for Harold Lloyd, it was just kind of the collegiate nerd. Um, his film Safety First is incredible. The pratfalls he did were terrifying and real. This is long before computer generated imagery, long before stuntmen. He did all his own stunts. And even in one stunt, he got half of his hand blown off from a stunt that went wrong. Um, he wore a prosthetic hand, and that never stopped him. He lived up until the 1970s. Buster Keaton was a very physical comedian too. He didn't much go past the silent films because he had kind of a rough speaking voice. severe alcoholic, and he was in the background for most of his the 30s and 40s. He kind of made a resurrection in the 60s by starring in these teen beach party movies. He wasn't the star, he was like a guest. He died in about 65 of just a hard life, alcoholism. He wasn't that old, in his 60s, I believe. Anyway, and then Charlie Chaplin, who lived up until the 1981 or so, was a genius of the highest order. His films were a revolution. He was not born in this country, but he lived here most of his life until they drove him back to Europe because he was suspected of being a communist. He was not, and he's also had supposedly sex with underage girls. That part is true. He married one and had 4 kids with her, so it was love. But they didn't want him here anymore. He was considered not a good citizen for America. He did come back in the late 70s, and the Oscars brought him out. He was grateful. He was crying. So he had his. They welcomed him back later when Hollywood wasn't so conservative. During the 1950s, Hollywood was worried about communism, and they went after actors and writers and directors who were suspected of being communists. And the political atmosphere was very dangerous. They lost their jobs, they lost their livelihood. In the 1950s, during this time, 10 Hollywood writers, some of them had won Academy Awards, were imprisoned for a year for contempt of court because they refused to name communists. Some of them did name names and they kept their careers going. Um, and that all went by the wayside uh, in the middle 50s, where the communist fear lessened. After World War II, Soviet Union and controlled everything. We did too. We both had the atomic bombs, and that's when the Cold War began. And so the 50s and 60s, well, hell, now we're still in a Cold War with them. They're still threatening to nuke Ukraine or wherever they may choose. I've lived with Russia's threats all my life. I'm tired of it. Um, when I was in grammar school in the early 60s, we used to have bomb scare, uh, what do you call it? Alarms. We had to train. If a nuclear bomb went off in Reading, what would we do? We had to train for that, prepare for it when I'm 10 years old. After a while, you get used to it and you don't ever think it's going to happen. Hasn't happened yet, except for once, and we did it and to Japan. So the 30s in America, movies were uh, they were curtailed by the Great Depression. People didn't have money. People didn't have jobs. They didn't have much money to spend on frivolous things like movies, but Hollywood knows how to get your buck. And so they started making films that they knew people would go to. They'd rather go hungry than to not see the next Fred Astaire musical, which is always usually a feel good movie. Uh, then they would have, we'd call them rom coms now, but they were called screwball comedies uh, with everybody, with Katharine Hepburn, Henry Fonda, Joel McRae made some great screwball comedies. And usually the screwball comedies were called that because they usually those movies made fun of wealthy people who weren't affected by the depression, and they were kind of getting their comeuppance in a way. And people like to laugh at rich people getting their comeuppance. Anyway, so that was really popular in the 30s. The other genre was low budget westerns with good guys against bad guys. John Wayne started his career in that era. Movies didn't get westerns didn't get serious until 1939 when John Ford made the first really adult western called Stagecoach with John Wayne and adult themes. When I say that, it means that it just wasn't good against evil. It was shades of gray. Um, then we had the other genre that was popular during this time was monster films. Uh, they were called horror films, but really they all had monsters like Werewolf, Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, The Mummy. Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. These were hugely popular. Uh, these mad scientists, because during this era in the 30s, science was starting to make huge inroads into our culture, and people didn't quite trust science like they do now, well, with the COVID. Remember that? Um, and people didn't know what the effects of the science is going to do. Well, in these movies, science always had a bad effect on humans. All you have to do is look at Frankenstein's monster and the mummy and the werewolf, usually all product of science gone awry. And this was popular along with the raise of threat of Nazis in Germany at that time. We couldn't fight the Nazis yet. That came later in the 40s, but we could fight them. We could fight these monsters and defeat them. And that was popular. Don't forget, first comic book that had Superman in it, action comic that came out, he was fighting Nazis. First comic book that had Wonder Woman in it, she was fighting Nazis. And so you could fight them in comic books and in movies, but you couldn't find them in real life until they started bombing everywhere and threatening everyone. And they went a step too far, and then we got in the war. And we'll talk about that later. Anyway, then the 30s ended on a great high note. The Depression came to an end. People were going back to work. Franklin Roosevelt was the president. He started this thing called the New Deal. They put taxpayers' money back into jobs. They created jobs. They were building highways and bridges. The freeway system in America started. They're building skyscrapers. The industrial age was going full bore because he put the American people back to work. Um, so 1939 was a bumper crop year of incredible Hollywood movies. Just to name a couple, Wuthering Heights, Gone with the Wind, and one of your favorites, Wizard of Oz. These are huge blockbuster movies. Hollywood sunk major film money into these things, and they made history. 1939 is considered one of the most historic movies in Hollywood in the world ever. Things weren't so good in Europe because they had been in a war. They're ramping up to war. They don't have the money we had. And so the films that were coming out of France and England were low budget movies, but they were making films in Japan also. World War II changed all that. We got into the war 1941 when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Um, that started it. Germany declared war on us, and the war was at war. But we still made movies. Some of the greatest movies ever made were made in 1940s. We're still in black and white, even though Gone with the Wind was in color. So was most of Wizard of Oz, but it was a really expensive process. So a lot of it, studios can afford it. So the 1940s started with a classic film. Orson Welles directed Citizen Kane. If this was my film class, we'd be watching it. You'd be writing about it, but we're not going to do that because we don't have time. I'm going to just do film this week, and then we're going to take a test when we come back from the holiday. So I'm doing as much as I can in this week. Today we're going through the 20s, the 30s. I'm in the 40s now. We had films, classic films like Grapes of Wrath, Casablanca. Maybe you've heard of these films. Maybe your grandparents know about them. Stars like Clark Gable and Humphrey Bogart, Katharine Hepburn, um, Barbara Stanwyck got huge in the 40s. Uh, People gathered around in the 40s to watch movies because when we went to war, it was a way of getting some kind of release from the terrors of what was going on in Europe. Now, we never got invaded here because we had the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean keeping us safe. Um, and so we weren't being bombed like London was and other countries in Europe, and we weren't being invaded like the islands on the Pacific Rim, or Japan even invaded China. They couldn't. They invaded. They tried to invade Australia and New Zealand. They couldn't get to us; it's too far away. But we did have. If anybody's been to San Francisco, we had fortifications set up on the coast in San Francisco. We had um, batteries of cannons and lookouts, always looking for Japan to invade us. They never did. They did get close. They did, but in New York Harbor, Germans sent U-boats. That's a submarine. They underwater submarine. That's why it's called a U-boat underwater. Anyway, they got into New York Harbor. They didn't kill anybody, and we barely ever found them because it was pretty stealth in those days. Not like all the security we have now with underwater devices and cameras and radar and sonar. Um, so um, the 40s saw um, some of the most incredible films. A lot of the World War II films that were made, a lot of them starred John Wayne and Van Johnson and other people, were mostly what they consider propaganda films. What I mean by that, they were selling war bonds. That's how they financed the war to private people. They didn't finance it with our taxpayers' money because it wasn't enough. They needed money and a lot of it fast. And so people would buy a war bond for $5, $10, $20 to go to the war effort. And where did you buy those war bonds? At the movie theater. They would come around and sell war bonds. There'd be advertisements for war bonds. Movie stars would show up and ask for help with war bonds. In days, we raised millions in this country for the effort to fight this war. Um, the men all were drafted or wanted to join the army because they knew it was the right thing to do. And that left the women at home to build the war machine. Women went to work in the factories and the boat docks. They built the tanks, the airplanes, the bullets. Without women, they were referred to as Rosie the Riveter, meaning if you don't know what a rivet is, it's a big heated spike that holds bridges and infrastructure together. That was a man's job. 1940s, the men were all in the army or going to fight, and women stepped up to the plate and they became the backbone of our defense. So, people like my mother and father, my father was a World War II veteran, he was a pilot, first lieutenant in the war. He flew airplanes in Belgium and France and Germany. Um, my mother was not in the army, but she was a young woman. She was, and they had the, I'm not kidding, I'm not exaggerating, they had the time of their lives. My father was in Europe for the first time. He was in London and he was in Germany and in places that, not Germany, Belgium, I should say. He didn't, I don't think he made it to Germany. Maybe he did, but Hitler was still there. So my point is, my mother always said it was a great time for her because my mother liked to go to dance at nightclubs, and she was dancing with all the handsome young men in uniforms. She married two of them, so she loved it. Um, and my father was free for the first time at 21 years old, 22 years old. He's in Europe. He's living abroad, and he was flying planes, and it wasn't. It was very dangerous, but he survived. That's why I'm here, folks. Um, so World War II was an upheaval in the country, but the whole country came together. It wasn't like it is now. We're all torn with the wars that are going on. Whether you support Ukraine or you support uh, Israel, Gaza, Palestinians, it's not easy to see who we need to support or who you believe needs to be supported. I know what my beliefs are. I'm not going to share them here because I don't want to upset anybody with my specific beliefs. That's not what I'm trying to do, is shove my beliefs, except for my belief in one thing. Cinema is a healing art. It's a collective art like no other. You have to go to a movie theater with other people. Of course, now it's all streaming on our big screens at home, but that wasn't the way it was in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. It wasn't until that way until 10 years ago. Um, Now nobody goes to the movie, especially since COVID closed down all the movie theaters. Uh, I went to two movies recently, not here in Reading, but in San Luis Obispo, and I really, really enjoyed the experience. I can't wait to go back to movie theaters. I think it's the best way to see them. But then I was raised in them. Um, we came out of the 1940s. We were a burnt out nation. Yes, we won both wars. We won the war, but it took a cost. We lost a lot of guys, young guys who never came back from that war, and also we were a different country. We were no longer naive or innocent, and the directors who went to fight in World War II who came back, I'm gonna show you guys a documentary called Five Who Came Back. Some major directors came back to this country after the war, and they could no longer make the entertainment fluff that they had been directing before. And it was John Ford, John Huston, William Wyler, um, Frank Capra, and I'm losing the name of the fifth one. Um, they had they were serious filmmakers, obviously. They made some very serious films. John Ford made Grapes of Wrath and Stagecoach and Mohawk Valley and um, Drums Along the Mohawk, I should say. And but other directors made kind of fluffy entertainment. George Stevens, that was his name, who was he was kind of a light. He made musicals. He made movies with the little uh, star, the child star in the 30s and 40s. Can't think of her name right now. Anyway, so he made kind of, and he didn't. He came back. He didn't know if he's going to come back to a job or not. They left their high-paying jobs to go join the army. They're all too old to fight, so they essentially formed a thing called the Cinema Corps, and they filmed the war. John Ford went to Pacific. Um, Others went to Europe. And if you've ever seen Saving Private Ryan, those are the D-Day invasion. Um, they filmed D-Day invasion with cameras, and a lot of them were killed. So it was a dangerous, dangerous job. John Ford was wounded in the Battle of Midway when shrapnel from a exploding ship hit him. So these guys were in their 50s, sometime in their 60s, and they were doing their best. They took away their big paychecks from Hollywood. They're making $50, $60 a month, and but they believed in the war effort. That's how passionately they believed in it. Um, and so when they came back, they no longer had an interest in doing the same kind of movies. And when Hollywood came knocking to John Ford, he said, "I can't direct those movies anymore. I got to tell the truth." And so his first movie out of the army was called They Were Expendable, a World War II movie, but we don't win. We lose. It's early goings in the war, and Hollywood didn't like it. They go, "No, we're winners." He goes, "We weren't winners. We lost a lot of good guys over there because we weren't prepared." So he made this very realistic film with John Wayne, Robert Montgomery, set in the Pacific, um, about how the fighting forces were. MacArthur said that they're expendable, and so meaning he knew they were going to be lost. That's the real General MacArthur who conducted the war in the Pacific. And but that movie is one of John Ford's best because it's so honest and pure and real. And when Frank Capra came back, his first movie was called It's a Wonderful Life. Maybe you watch it during Christmas. Well, look at that movie closely. What is it about? It's about a guy who's committing suicide. He doesn't feel like he was made a difference. He doesn't feel like anybody in the town cares about him. And that's the film he wanted to make, a dark, depressing film about a guy who wants to kill himself on Christmas Eve. An angel comes down from heaven, shows him what the town would be like without him, and he changes his mind, learns to love his life, his hometown, his wife, his kids, no longer wants to kill himself. When that movie got made with James Stewart, who had been in the war, by the way, he quit, and he was a pilot. He said, "This is going to kill my career. Nobody's going to want to watch this movie about this guy wanting to commit suicide." Well, it wasn't a huge hit when it came out, but now it's a Christmas perennial that we all love. Um, William Wyler, who was from Europe, a German Jew who ran from Hitler in the 30s and came to this country and made some wonderful films, made his first movie was The Diary of Anne Frank. Anne Frank is the little Jewish girl that was hiding in the attic from the Nazis in Holland and wrote her diary. They made a movie about it. It doesn't end well, folks. She dies in the concentration camp. Uh, that's what he wanted to make. Even George Stevens, who had made these kind of lightweight films, um, came in and did something not like his normal thing. Um, I'm forgetting the name of the movie right offhand because now I'm thinking about um, Best Years of Our Lives. I think he directed that, right? Do I have that right? It's about these returning veterans after the war, how they are readjusting to their hometown. And it's uplifting, but it's real. They were gone for 5 years. Their town is different. They're different. They've seen things that nobody should see. This is long before we had post traumatic stress syndrome. They had it. My dad had it. They didn't call it that, though. Um, my dad had nightmares about the war all his life. That's probably why he was a very quiet man, a very successful businessman, and like a lot of guys from that generation, an alcoholic. That's how they dealt with their pain. So in the 40s, this genre, 50s, this genre, and I'm going to stop at this, called film noir, black film, that's what that means in French. And it was these dark, my favorite genre, actually, film noir. Um, what happens at night in American cities? They made maybe 50, 60 noir films. Everybody was scrambling at night to find their identity. They could not adjust to life in America anymore. It wasn't all rainbow and sunshines and unicorns like it had been. And these movies depicted a reality that nobody wanted to face. They did. Next time I talk to you guys, I'm going to run through the 50s, 60s, and up into the modern times. That's it. I hope you guys are getting this. I know you missed my face. Get your papers in on time. Make sure you see the due dates. I'm going to sign a paper right now. It's going to be due Friday. I'm sorry, it's only 4 days, 5 days, but we need to have a holiday so we can take a break. And I don't want you guys doing your papers over the break. All right. If you get your papers in late, please notify me. You can hand them into my email, rexhaas@yahoo.com. You will lose points for being late, but some points is better than no points. Do your best. Keep thinking. Stay alive. Stay healthy, warm, because it's going to get cold in a couple of days and rain again. And I'll see you in a couple of days. Hopefully, my camera might be working. Adios.